what we were told by multiple intelligence officers was state actor level, in other words, nation state intelligence agency level phone hacking,
Oh,
in
yeah, that's
which
right.
they were whoever was doing this to the Havana Syndrome victims was able to um, remotely access their phones and task their phones to do things, and in fact disable their phones so that they became, as one of the victims put it, a brick in his hand, and then heat those phones up so they became too hot to handle. Um, and you know, the U.S. government looked into that and found out that there was an what in signals intelligence terms is called and phone hacking terms is called an exploit.
We have eyes on. Roger.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Eyes On. Very special one today. We have Jack Murphy and Sean Naylor, the creators and producers of the High Side Substack. The link is in the description. If you don't know what the High Side is, it is a pretty in-depth media outlet where these two guys go pretty I'm going to say it again, pretty in-depth in terms of stories they produce and write. The most recent one was about the original Havana Syndrome victims that got hit in Havana and their story, uh, which is wild. I mean, I was reading this yesterday, and it was kind of like shocking me a little bit, like how like the level of harassment they've been getting. We'll go into it deep, and just like the ineptitude, I think, of like counterintelligence by the FBI. Um, Yeah, guys, welcome. And again, the iSide Substack, the link is in the description. Go check it out. They do great stuff. They've done a great, and they're continuing to do a great profile on Willie Murkison, who is a legend. The deep dive on the Omega teams, and I know there's something cooking. I'm not going to talk about it, but there's more stuff cooking, and it's stuff you won't find anywhere else. You won't find it really on the New York Times. I mean, or Washington Post or Wall Street Journal, like in their investigative stuff. It's really in-depth reporting that you can't get anywhere else. So the link is in the description. Check that out. The High Side. Hey, boys.
Hey,
Yeah, thanks,
great to
Steve.
be here. Great to be
So where the hell do we even start? I mean,
Well, I mean, I would start from the perspective of this story at least. The story for the subject of it starts in 2016, really. But for us, it starts just a couple years ago, when Sean and I were put in touch with the person who's known as Patient Zero of Havana Syndrome, a guy that goes by the name Adam. The CIA won't let him release his actual real name. For Byzantine reasons that are beyond our understanding. They won't let him say his actual name, but I drove out into the middle of nowhere to see this guy, an undisclosed location, because of because of what we'll talk about in this interview. I think it'll become clear why he is protective about his security. So I drove out there and spent like a day and a half with him, to try to see. And remember, this was like 2 years ago, so a lot had been written about Havana Syndrome, and I was really trying to gauge, like, is there more here? Like, is there still, it's still so many mysteries around it, but is there another story that I can latch onto and write? And my conversation with Adam definitely led me to believe that there was. And then from there, it just sort of became a question of like, how do you go about writing it? Because this could be like a 3 volume book series easily. So
here.
it's like, how do you like parse it down? And so my tool, I guess, to try to do that was to just focus on the initial cohort of people that were struck in Havana, Cuba, 2016, 2017. And somewhere way down the line, if I were to do a sequel to this story or sequels, I would do one about the people in China. I would do one about the people in Austria. But for this article, which is substantially long, it's like 16,000 words, it really just homes in on the original Havana victims.
yeah, I mean, and their story is kind of incredible, what they've kind of gone through. Roadblocks both on our own side, like CIA kind of like blocking them from getting medical treatment and trying to steer them into a different different diagnosis. There's a point where like they try to diagnose them with a concussion rather than TBI, because a concussion's a lot more you could just explain it away a little bit more.
There are also some legalities involved there, as it turns out, that when you have injured federal employees, the government is not supposed to be directing their care. In other words, they can't tell them, you have to go see this doctor. You can go and see your own doctor.
Sure.
They were playing that game like, oh, this classified information. You can't just go and tell any neurologist about this. And as I understand it, I've been told that like that's illegal under federal labor laws.
Yeah. And I mean, I think, you sort of mentioned in the intro that what we have on the high side generally, and this is sort of almost like a requirement for our stories, is it has to be something that you cannot read anywhere else, because we're asking people to pay for subscriptions, and so I and Jack and I want to deliver to them in every story material that they will not find elsewhere. And in this story, that sort of falls into two overarching categories. One, as sort of Jack has implied, it's the most detailed look at what actually happened in Havana, um, and the sort of what happened to that cohort of patients when they came back to the States. But the second sort of block of new information, if you like, is this extraordinary campaign of harassment and intimidation to which those individuals were subjected in the United States by persons unknown, certainly to them and to us, although there are a few clues littered about. And this, I mean, when we heard this, I was just astounded, because there's been an awful lot written about Havana Syndrome over the years. And I certainly can't claim to have read every last word of it. And there have been multiple sort of multi-episode podcasts about it and so forth. And I had never heard of this before. I mean, essentially, someone or someones targeted the members of the cohort of that Havana cohort who came back to the United States and were, for the most part, all receiving treatment at different locations, with the sort of spy versus spy tactics that you would expect to see, that US intelligence officers expect to be on the receiving end of in hard target locations like Russia, like China, like Havana, like Cuba, and oddly enough, like Israel as well. But it is unprecedented for US intelligence officers to be targeted with those tactics in the United States, in their own homes. And, we're talking about folks who had their homes broken into repeatedly, burglarized, and well, not all the time, but almost all the time, with subtle messages being left for them. For instance, in an interview that Jack did with one of the victims who we call Frank, he had his home in Northern Virginia broken into, and he had a collection basically of firearms that included 3 long guns, 2 AR-15s and an AK-47, and 5 handguns, all in Pelican cases and all hidden upstairs in his attic. Whoever broke into his home somehow knew where those guns were going to be, got them, brought them downstairs, laid them out on the beds in his master bedroom and his spare bedroom, didn't steal them, but stole the Pelican cases, which are pretty pricey in and of themselves. I mean, people who know more about these things than I do tell me that they're worth, for a long gun, a Pelican case is easily worth more than $1,000. And
don't forget that they also helped themselves to the
yes,
Cuban rum and cigars that he brought back with him.
yes, and I think that's that's a telling detail, right there. I mean, this particular individual, and another sort of fairly creepy thing that happened to him was when he was in Philadelphia receiving treatment, as many of the subjects of our article were at the University of Pennsylvania for their Havana Syndrome. Somebody broke into his apartment there and stole two cases of Peet's Coffee K-Cups, which apparently he was very,
Fond
very,
of.
very fond of.
Yeah, I remember that part.
And then 2 years later, in one of the multiple break-ins to his home in Northern Virginia, those two cases were left behind, as just a signal to him, hey, we're still watching you, we're still on your case. Another time they broke into his home and they found some of his medical records related to Havana Syndrome, and they copied them on his copy machine and left with the copies. And he and his partner only discovered that when there was some button on their copy machine that told them all the documents that had been copied over the last so many days or weeks, and they realized that the burglars had actually copied those documents. As he put it to us, it was almost like they were trying to check the damage that they'd done to him, by checking his medical records. So I mean, there are stories and stories and stories like that in our article about just incredibly crazy stuff that happened to these folks. Dead deers being left on their porch. In one case, that was a Havana Syndrome victim, but not one of the victims from who was struck in Havana themselves.
Hey guys, it's Jack. I just want to talk to you for a moment about how you can support the show if you've been watching it, enjoying it, but you'd like to get a little bit more involved and help us continue to do this. You can check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/theteamhouse. And for $5 a month, you can get access to all of these episodes of The Team House ad-free. The same goes with our affiliated podcast, Eyes On, with Andy Milburn, Jason Lyons, Mick Mulroy. That one, you will also get all of those episodes ad-free. And you support the channel and the show, and we really appreciate it. The Patreon members are literally what has helped this company, this small business survive, especially during our early years. And you are what continues to help this thing going, even as we navigate the turbulent world of YouTube advertising. So we really appreciate all of you guys. There's going to be a link down in the description to that Patreon page, and there is also going to be a link to our new merch shop. So if you guys want to go and get some Team House merchandise, we got stickers, and we also have patches. And I should mention, if you sign up for Patreon at $10 a month, we will mail you this patch as well. So we really appreciate that. But they're also for sale on the merch shop. And additionally, they got t-shirts up there, water bottles, a tote bag, coffee mugs, all that good stuff. So please go and check them out and support the show. We really appreciate it, guys. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the one where they stole the Pelican cases for the rifles and stuff like that, they also left a nice little present for them in their bathroom too,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And
that's a typical thing that the Cubans would do in Havana. That's a sort of like a little calling card. So it's interesting that that the same things that happened to U.S. intelligence officers in Havana were happening to them in the United States.
Yeah, and I think it's important to let people know, like when they're in hard, places and serving in like Russia, China, Havana, and anywhere else where it's a more of a hardship tour. This is to be expected, right? Like they train for this, they understand that this is going to happen when you're abroad. But yeah, you're going back to your apartment in Virginia or in Philadelphia, and you're finding the same tactics going on in the United States, where you're supposed to kind of it was relatively you're relatively off
Yeah.
limits, and then you hit up the FBI like what you're supposed to do, and FBI is supposed to be the premier counterintelligence agency that we have, right? They're supposed to go after the spies that are in America, and it seems like the FBI was just like kind of out to lunch with this.
Yeah,
so was CIA.
yeah.
Well, CIA, I feel like CIA just didn't want to deal with well, you would think that too. The alarm bells would ring too, but I can understand the CIA's point because they're trying to like muzzle these guys. It seems like, right? It seems like that's what they've been trying to do for the last 10 years, almost 10 years, 8, 9 years. So it's just, yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I think it's hard to know. I mean, we quote another Havana Syndrome victim, someone who was struck in Moscow, Mark Polymeropoulos, a sort of friend of the team house, if you like, saying that why the FBI behaved as it did in this context is one of the big unanswered questions of the whole Havana Syndrome story. And you you can look at it from several angles. There are several possible explanations. One is sheer incompetence. You know, a lot of these incidents happened in Philadelphia. The CIA officers with whom we spoke were particularly cutting in their remarks about the abilities of the counterintelligence team, the very small counterintelligence team in the Bureau's Philadelphia office. So it could be that they just weren't very good then. But I mean, enough of this stuff happened elsewhere that you would think that other folks would get involved who were probably better. But there seemed to be a marked disinterest in really finding out who was behind this. And to me, that's not 100 miles away from other similar disinterest we've seen in the last 10 years over incidents that have occurred in the United States that common sense might lead you to suspect the Russians might have been responsible for. I mean, there have been various associates of Vladimir Putin and so forth died in very unusual circumstances. I mean, one, in a hotel beside DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C., that there's been a strange eagerness to sort of adopt a nothing to see here attitude from on the part of the U.S. government. Doesn't matter which administration is in power.
Those
And
counterintelligence investigations are very odd too, the way they're so close hold and they go on for decades oftentimes. So it's not totally uncommon for like docked up into a CI investigation and just disappear. But I felt the same thing. I mean, that there's a you can't help but feel that there's a political component of it, meaning that like for years and years, the federal government didn't go after Chinese espionage because they were seen as our favored trading partner, and any sort of CI investigation involving the Chinese was just sort of seen as like an annoyance, like, oh, why do we have to do this? And I mean, this is purely speculative on my part, but I couldn't help but think that when it comes to this case with the Havana Syndrome victims, that the reason why they don't want to look too hard is because the answers just bring more questions. The biggest one being, how does the opposition even know how to target covered CIA personnel within the United States? How do they have their personnel information? How do they know where they live? How do they know their real names? Those are all very, very concerning questions that I haven't heard anyone ask at all.
Yeah. Yep. I mean, I think Jack's hit the nail on the head there. There's, you know, it not only raises a lot of awkward questions for the US government, but it also forces tough decisions on them. If you find out that a nation state is targeting your intelligence officers inside the United States, what are you going to do about that? Are you going to target their officers in their home countries? Do you even have the ability to do that? Are you going to shut down their embassy? Are you going to, bring more sanctions on them? I mean, one of the sort of one of the many sort of interesting facets that we uncovered in our investigation, we spoke with a lawyer called Mark Zaid, a Washington lawyer who's been in the news recently because he's fallen afoul of Donald Trump by, representing the wrong Americans and therefore being stripped of his security clearance by Trump. But he represents a couple of dozen Havana Syndrome victims. And he told us that some of these victims who were not the ones who were struck in Cuba, but were struck elsewhere, whether that's Russia or other parts of the world, or even in the United States, some of them were Russian experts. And they have been on the receiving end of similarly sort of creepy episodes, beg your pardon, with people tailing them, photographing them, and so forth, just as we describe has happened to some members of the Havana cohort. And but on those cases, when they were able to trace back who was doing this to them, it turned out to be Russian speakers. Whereas a lot of the hints about and clues about who was targeting the actual Havana cohort members in the United States pointed, not conclusively, but indirectly, to links to Havana. So, it's quite possible that Cuba and Russia were coordinating on this. We have, we're a long way from being able to say we have conclusive proof, but those are the two obvious suspects.
There was an incredible part in the story where Adam and Mike are sitting having breakfast. I guess just before they're going to get treatment at the University of Pennsylvania, and they catch a guy just straight up taking pictures of him. And they reported to the FBI. I guess the FBI went over the security tapes, followed it, tracked them where he was going that day, and he literally jumped on a plane and left, and they figured he was a foreign national. And it wasn't even covert. It was obviously overt.
Yeah.
So you need to see, I'm in the window of the restaurant, snapping pictures at you guys. You're the only people in there.
Yeah, that's called harassing surveillance.
It's
intended to be seen.
Yeah. And I'm assuming that there's still a counterintelligence investigation going on and stuff like that. And Jack, just to go back to what you mentioned, where the more you dig in, the more questions you have, and there's questions that no one really wants to ask or answer. This is me speculating, but could there be a penetration at CIA or anywhere else?
How else would they have that targeting data? It could only come from inside the building.
Right. That's the scary part,
Either that or, there's a few. I'm sort of speaking off the top of my head here. But clearly they knew who the Havana, the DI, the Cuban uh, intelligence service in Cuba knew who they were targeting in Havana. So tracking those guys in the United States, if you already know their identities, that is probably you've gotten past one of the hurdles there. Um, but it's still challenging to track them all the way up to Philadelphia and what apartments are they staying in and so forth. I mean, that's in very that has to be very troubling from a counterintelligence point of view. In addition, something we haven't talked about yet is the what we were told by multiple intelligence officers was state actor level, in other words, nation state intelligence agency level phone hacking,
Oh,
in
yeah, that's
which
right.
they were whoever was doing this to the Havana Syndrome victims was able to um, remotely access their phones and task their phones to do things, and in fact disable their phones so that they became, as one of the victims put it, a brick in his hand, and then heat those phones up so they became too hot to handle. Um, and the U.S. government looked into that and found out that there was what in signals intelligence terms is called and phone hacking terms is called an exploit. And I'm at about the edge of my knowledge of that sort of technology here, but they were able to shut that down. But they also discovered that there was a network of burner phones that were sort of involved in this operation. That as the authorities closed in Philadelphia, that network of burner phones just went silent, and they couldn't grab them. I just wanted to make them in case we have viewers or listeners who haven't yet read the story, that the case of the photographer in the window in Philadelphia, which we lead the story with, because it was such an extraordinary event, and we had photographs that the two CIA officers who were having breakfast in the window of this cafe, when the guy shows up on the sidewalk outside the window and starts pointing his camera at them and taking photographs. And we're talking about a real camera here. We're not talking about a cell phone camera. We're talking about a professional level camera with a long lens. That we have those photographs, and we reproduce some of those photographs in the article that the intelligence officers took of whoever this was on the sidewalk. It's also important to mention that, unlike breaking into somebody's home and stealing something from their home, I don't think it's illegal to take photographs of people on a public sidewalk. I'm not a lawyer, and so I'm welcome. I welcome being corrected on that. So it's not as if that individual was doing anything illegal, and
Sure.
we certainly don't say in the article that that person was a Cuban spy or a Russian spy or agent or witting or unwitting. We don't know who he was.
Just that he's a foreign national, according to the FBI.
That's what they were told. We
Right.
quote one of our sources saying
Right.
that. But it was very curious and suspicious behavior.
A little bit back on like the CIA basically running a defense on their own officers that got injured. It was wild what was going on. Like when they wanted to go see the doctor in Miami, who's a highly regarded doctor, a neurologist or whatever, and they ended up starting to like, no, we're not going to actually pay for your flights to Miami to go get treatment and stuff like that. It's just, I don't know. I mean, the way they handled this was pretty unbelievable. Where it's now blown up and is a big news story, and it has been for years. It's like the opposite of what you should do. Like take care of your guys and figure out what the fuck's going on, and maybe hit back.
it's probably the biggest scandal the CIA has had since WMDs in Iraq. I mean,
Yeah.
it's sizable. And I mean, what we uncover is that a lot of it, especially initially, first there's some disbelief that this was actually happening. But also there were people who remember the whole Moscow microwaves thing in the 1970s and 80s. And that it was just sort of a morass, right? You'd never really know, like, yeah, the embassy was being bombarded with microwaves. What effect did that have on people? What did it not have? You know, what were the microwaves intended to do? What weren't they intended to? It turned into this like morass, and there still are unanswered questions about that to this day. And I think they just did not want to go down that rabbit hole and start it over again.
Yeah, I think that's right. And uh, you know, but it goes back to what we were saying earlier. It also they didn't really want to lift up that rock and look under it. And I suspect, without any proof, that that reluctance went higher than just the seventh floor of the original headquarters building at CIA headquarters in Langley. I suspect that that reluctance uh, went, probably went higher than that, because what administration wants to face into all of those tough questions and all of those tough decisions, that actual proof uh, of your intelligence officers being targeted and zapped with some uh, weapon abroad forces you into, and as we discussed earlier, then those self same intelligence officers being targeted uh, in Northern Virginia or downtown Philadelphia as if they were in Moscow or Beijing or or Havana, and and there's a real I think reluctance to face into some of that, and there's another potential you know reason which we'll probably get to, well, we'll definitely get to in part two of the series, so we don't want to talk too much about it, but there may be self-serving reasons why the United States government doesn't want to delve too deeply or speak too publicly about what sort of devices are being used to target its intelligence officers.
We also, it's important to understand and remember that the Obama administration was trying to normalize relations with Cuba during this time.
Yeah.
And I think that like one of the most interesting things that, some historian 75 years from now will have to piece together is like the whole tit for tat and geopolitical chess match that got played between CIA and Cuban and Russian intelligence services. Um, because we were normalizing relations and there was this opening, the CIA people who were going down there were told that we're taking more of a gloves off approach, just meaning that they're going to be more aggressive about recruitments, trying to recruit Cuban citizens on the island. Did that lead to some sort of retaliation or greater retaliation? Um, and then, of course, the normalization itself between the United States and Cuba is something that would be a bad thing for who? For what country? Russia. And you saw after everything got rolled back, Russia has one of their submarines parked in Cuba, and all kinds of other stuff going on.
And as you pull the camera back from just Cuba, and this isn't really the focus of our article, but you look at the other locations where folks have come down with Havana Syndrome, a lot of them are in these countries where there's a renewed contest between Russia and the United States for influence. Austria being one, Vietnam being another,
India.
Cuba, obviously, being one, the Central Asian countries, and so it's there's no way for us to prove it right now, but that's a factor that might be playing into this as well.
Yeah, there was another interesting part during the article. You guys actually have a recording that Adam, I believe, took
Mm.
of the sound that he heard and what made him, get vertigo, puke, and essentially the onset of all his symptoms. And there was a part in the article, and clarify it for me, where the CIA has their analysts look at it and they're like, "Oh no, it's crickets."
No,
Was that the CIA or was that
I
somebody
think
else?
I
Excuse
That
me.
think
was
you've got
Jason
that.
Group.
Yeah,
Jason
it was.
groups. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
right. That's right.
and it was the CIA who, when they first analyzed it, the Department of Science and Technology, DS&T, as it's known at the agency, um, they analyzed that very quickly when Adam sent it up to them shortly after he was struck, and they came to a very sort of chilling conclusion. They ran it through all their sort of machines, and they sent a message back down, within hours saying you were exposed to something that, man-made that can cause serious injury and or death. So, that was their first take. It's interesting that despite that being having that immediate knowledge at CIA headquarters, how much shade they threw at the Havana Syndrome victims, over the next months and years. So when it came to the crickets that
Yeah, and
some people
explain what the
said,
Johnson group is and stuff like that, just for
Jason,
folks. Jason group, sorry.
Jack, you want to take that?
I mean, as I understand it, it's just a group of scientists that consult with the United States government. I asked one of my professors, actually, he was a nuclear seismologist, about Jason, and he said, yeah, it's interesting that they're kind of like groomed, I guess, very early on in their careers for those positions, which I imagine there's not very many of them. But yeah, they produced this report early on. With, as far as I know, they didn't look at any actual evidence. They didn't look at any of the evidence even we have, to come to this conclusion. Well, they were probably just hearing crickets. And well, when these guys start going to see the doctor, when they go start to see Dr. Hoffer in Miami, I mean, he points out the symptoms and the physical effects, physical injuries that these guys have in their inner ear and the brain. They cannot be imagined or faked. It cannot be psychosomatic. It cannot be mass hysteria. Like, it's impossible to fake those injuries.
Yeah, I mean and you you have to apply some common sense to this, okay? If crickets or cicadas or any insects in Cuba could damage the brains of dozens of US embassy staffers, and remember that the embassy was capped at, like, I think 55 staff. So although there were people coming down on temporary duty to replace the folks who had already been hurt and gone back to the United States, you're talking about a very high percentage of staff at the United States Embassy. Well, if the crickets were able to inflict that level of damage on the staff of one embassy, Cuba would be uninhabitable for human
Right.
beings, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it just would. And so, like I said, and then look at the stuff that we report on this, in this article on the high side about the sort of all of the aggressive harassment and intimidation of the victims in the United States. If the crickets had done that, or if this was a sort of psychosomatic, it's all in their head sort of phenomenon, who would care enough to go after these guys and gals in the United States? I mean, that
Yeah.
that just doesn't make any sense.
Going back to like when the Obama administration was normalizing relations with Cuba, and we restaff the embassy down there and stuff like that. Wouldn't it behoove Cuba, if they're trying to like make nice with the US, to not you do the harassment stuff, take a shit in the toilet and stuff like that, fuck around, but like to actually injure these people, I feel like is a step above normal like spycraft, right? And normal.
Yeah.
So my question, I guess, and where I'm leaning to is like, do you think that like Russia probably, I mean, Russia's running around Cuba, right? They have to have GRU and SVR guys running around there. Could Russian guys have done this to the US
Yeah.
personnel
Yeah,
there?
it's certainly possible. But it would be highly unlikely that the Cubans would not be read into it on some level, that DGI would not know about it. Now, there's an interesting moment where the ambassador to Cuba, Ambassador De Laurentiis, meets with Raul Castro in his office over this very issue. And Raul Castro looks him right in the eye and says, "We are not behind this. We did not do this. I run this island. I would never authorize that." And I mean, I think that it's possible they were working together, but it's also possible that the Cubans, maybe they knew something. Maybe they knew the Russians were there setting up quote unquote surveillance gear and did not know the full extent of what was being established on the island. But again, there are still some unanswered questions there.
Yep, yep. No, there are many unanswered questions. Although we, as I was mentioning earlier, in terms of the campaign against against the U.S. intelligence officers in the United States, the ones that were linked to Cuba, the the clues led back to Cuba for who was targeting them, and the ones that were linked to Russia, the clues, seemed to point towards Russia. But we asked one of the Cuba cohort CIA officers, do you think those two nations or in their spy services are working together? And he sort of chuckled and said, "Yeah, only on days that end in Y."
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
Yeah. And I think also you need to point out that the rules of espionage had been changing for a while. You had the Russian security services poisoning dissidents in the United Kingdom with radioactive material. I mean, that's done to send a message. Like they want you to know that we can reach you, we can touch you anywhere. So, in the past, they'd say that, this was sort of a gentleman's game that operated on Moscow rules. That's kind of out the window now. Everything that's happened in 2016 and then Ukraine, I mean, those rules and the conversations we have about like rules-based international order and everything, like that's the past. That's over now.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of gnarly because it's like what you would do probably if you're just trying to intimidate. Like it's kind of like what like a kingpin or drug lord would do. You know what I mean? It's
This
more
is what you
criminal
would
than
do if the two countries were at war with each other,
yeah.
right?
Yeah, and you do see the uptick in Russian sabotage across Europe and stuff like that. I mean, the gloves do kind of seem to be off more and more, at least in the espionage world.
absolutely, yeah.
When is part two coming out? And why can't I read it beforehand? For God's sakes.
Because it's in draft form.
Okay.
Yeah, and we have. I mean, there's only two of us at the high side, and we do our very best to make sure that the stories that come out, adhere to all the professional standards that you would expect from much better financed news organizations. And we have other stories. I mean, we have, just in terms of short-term news stories, probably three that we're trying to nail that I can just think of off the top of my head between us over the next week or two. And long-term projects, as you mentioned, we have the Willie Murkison story, and the next, that's been on a sort of a slight hiatus since the fall. But we're coming back with a really big, juicy story on that about a covert action in Africa that you have to read about to believe, and that's never been written about before, to my knowledge. And so, but I, I'm always, I mean, Jack can speak for himself. I'm always reluctant ahead of time to say, we're going to bring this story out on this date because, it can set you up for either letting people down or rushing something into print before it's quite ready and doesn't quite have the professional sheen that we want it to have. But I mean, we're probably talking for part two, sort of weeks, not months. I mean, Jack, you let me know your thoughts.
I mean, it's been so long. I mean, I have to go back and look at what we have, Sean, because
Yeah.
I don't even know where we're at the moment. And
Yeah.
I think off the top of my head, I need to go and talk to some sources too, to get that out the door.
Yeah.
And yeah, there's a few other things we're working on at the same time.
And again, just to remind the readers, every single story we're talking about now is something you would not have read before. Every single one. Um, Legitimate, fairly significant, potentially news stories that that haven't been covered anywhere else. And I'm not trying to throw shade at other news organizations.
You could
I'm
do
saying
it. Go ahead.
they're choosing not to cover them. I'm just saying that there's a lot of stuff going on in the world, and every national security reporter in the United States is spread thin right now.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm trying to remember from the article, CIA, when you guys go for comment, like they were just like boilerplate kind of comment
Yeah.
they gave
They
you?
gave us a one paragraph, we're trying to do better by our officers. I mean, I'm paraphrasing there, but
Yeah.
And the
and the
FBI
FBI,
didn't even respond.
yep, nothing from the FBI.
Wow. I mean, and listen, I understand like probably Philadelphia is not exactly a spy capital. Compared to New York or DC and stuff is what I'm trying to
Sure.
say.
Yeah.
But so like, but okay, you get the call and you have a couple CIA guys that are going or more that are going to the University of Pennsylvania for treatment. It's like, how about we shoot a couple people up from DC and bolster these ranks a little bit and do what we need to do. The Northern Virginia stuff is nuts to me as well. Like where they're not all their counterintelligence department is not, antennas up. What's going on here? Let's figure it out. It's kind of shocking to me, and I get like probably the FBI is spread thin and stuff like that, like anybody else, but you would assume that counterintelligence, especially like Russian or Chinese or Cuban, is priority one.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's also interesting to note the difference. This really isn't in the article, but there's a difference between how the Department of Defense and how the CIA responded to Havana Syndrome. And my impression is that DOD, including SOCOM and JSOC, took this much more seriously, much quicker. And they saw it as like a problem we need to solve. Like, what's the fix? Let's do the Army thing and figure out how to defeat this. So they were, I don't want to say perfect or anything like that, but they were much more aggressive, I think, in confronting this than the intelligence community was. Oh, but then even then, there are caveats, right? I've been told that the NSA actually is pretty aggressive on this.
Okay. Why do you think the DOD stepped up faster and harder compared to CIA, FBI?
I think it's a cultural issue. I think it's just like Army can-do attitude, like let's jump into this and get it done. Whereas the CIA was like, this is a big headache we don't want to have to deal with.
Is it fair to assume we have weapons like this too, and we don't want to like say that we do, or admit that we do, or confirm we do?
Yeah,
Got to
even
wait for part
publicly.
two.
Oh, shit. Okay. Now I just teased the. I mean, I got to get this early release. This is unacceptable. I have a little bit of a into the high side, so I'm expecting the article before it goes to print. So I won't say anything, but because the first thing I said is like, Jack, send me part two. What are you doing? And he's like, it's not done yet. I'm like, God. It's an incredible. I mean, it reads like a movie. It's like a thriller. It's insane. You can't believe that it's real life.
What do people say? I mean, I'm not particularly religious, but your words to God's ears, right? Feel free, feel free, D, to let all your Hollywood contacts know
I
that.
will. I mean, I do have whatever. I mean, like I have some, so I will because it's fucking nuts. If I watched this in a movie, I would be like, this is bullshit. There's no way this is going
Yeah,
on in America in Virginia and Philly.
yeah,
Harassing surveillance like on I get it happens in Vienna or it happens everywhere else, like we mentioned, but and they understand that that's going to happen. It's going to be a hardship tour. It's what it is. Um, how Adam and Mike, how are they, and Frank, how are they doing today in terms of symptoms? You know,
They're doing better. Part of this story is charting like their medical journey as well and interviewing the doctors and scientists that studied this. And they went through some pretty extensive rehabilitation. Like what happens is the inner ear damage, it hits the vestibular system, which is what induces what's commonly known as vertigo. And then there's the actual brain damage. And there are treatments, there are therapies to go through. What the guys told me was that they don't so much cure the problem, but they teach them how to live with the symptoms, like how to adapt to them and adapt their lives around them. And so they're doing better now than they were. But the amount of bitterness and anger towards the United States government for how they were treated, the psychological damage, sometimes called moral injury, is very real. And my sense is that it exists with all of them.
yeah. It was a good part in the article where I think it was Mike, somebody who got hit and who was used to like performing at a high level, who could barely write cables
yeah,
and barely do their job, right? Like you live your whole life being a top performer and being able to handle these things and have a photographic memory and stuff like that. And then you go to not being able to concentrate, not be able to drive to work. Um, yeah, I can understand the emotional and mental like fallout from doing so from that, right?
yeah, yeah. I mean, that's a common theme that you hear from, I don't want to say every last victim, but certainly
Mark
a lot of,
Polymeropoulos mentioned the same thing.
yeah, because these are high speed individuals, you know. They, it's it's not easy to get into CIA. It's not easy to get through some of the courses that you have to go through. And when you emerge from that, you're a high speed individual who's now very highly trained. And to go from that to not being able to write properly, to have to put stickies on, on walls or on laptops to remind you what to do and so forth. That's that's very psychologically troubling. And at least one of our sources who we quote extensively in the article, struggled with suicidal ideation um, as a result of that.
Yeah, it really is an incredible story. I'm not just saying it because I know you guys. I mean, I was on the edge of my seat reading it. I couldn't fucking believe it because you've heard a lot of stories about the Havana Syndrome, and it really focuses more on like CIA kind of running defense on these people, trying censoring that report that came out, things like that, which I think should be told as well. But like you really get into the nitty gritty of like the first people that got hit with this, right? Patient zero, who the name is Havana Syndrome for a reason, right? It happened to
Yeah.
a guy in Havana. Um,
And
it's really incredible.
CIA was really working overtime too to craft the public narrative about this issue. I've been told that they brought reporters from major newspapers into CIA for briefings before various IG reports came out. And that's
Insane.
why the day that it's internally released, the classified version is internally released, that very day, Washington Post has a story,
Right.
the CIA's story. It's the story they were given.
I mean, I'm sure there's some great reporters at those outlets, Washington Post and Wall Street Journal, New York Times, but more and more it seems like they are just basically glorified press secretaries.
I wouldn't go that far.
All right, I'm being a little hyperbolic. It's okay. But you're telling me they're not, exchanging positive stories for a little bit more access, and like for like the deputy director to answer their text when they text them and things like that.
I don't know that, so
Okay.
I'm unwilling to make that.
I'm completely speculating and making that accurate. Let me be fair, okay? The articles, Lamps Slaughter, Part 1. I cannot wait for Part 2. How the CIA failed its officers in Cuba and the FBI failed them at home. It's on the High Side Substack. The link is in the description. Work you're not going to read anywhere else. And if you're not a reader, they have an audio version. You can listen to it on the audio. If you can't, you got hit by Havana Syndrome and can't read, I guess. Honestly, one of the better investigative articles I've read in a very long time. And no duh. I mean, Sean Naylor and Jack Murphy, you guys know what you're doing. Anything else? Tell me. What do we got? Talk to me.
Jack.
On Havana, or like in general? What
are up to you, potpourri, bro.
Yeah, so I mean, part 2 of the Havana Syndrome story, I can't, and look, I've been on this topic honestly for so long, my head has been in it for so long that like I can't really tell you does this story we published, like how important is it? Is it going to be important to people? Is it not going to be? It's hard for me to judge because I've been inside it for so long.
Yeah.
And with part 2, it's going to be kind of like starting over again in some ways. But that's going to get more into some of the technical specifications of the device that would be used to do this, and how it works. And I interviewed some people who worked at quite high levels on this. So that should be interesting. And then there's other pieces that we're working on. I'm working on other stories about the special operations community, about the intelligence community, that hopefully we'll see out there in the next couple months.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, and look out for the Willie Murkison continuation.
Yeah.
We are also working on for Team House folks, having Mark P. and possibly Adam on the show from the article, which I'm looking forward to. I'm really looking forward to that. So I'll keep a lookout on that. Yeah, this is great. Guys, check out the article. It's the High Side Substack. Just Google the High Side Substack. The link will be in the description and the show notes, so it's easy to find right there. All the other links for everybody will be down in the description as well. The High Side Twitter, Sean's Twitter, Jack's Twitter, but he's not on Twitter, so if you think you're talking to Jack, you're talking to me. Everything else down in the description for all the boys too, Mick, Andy, and Jason. And the best possible way what you could do to support the show, first and foremost, is patreon.com/theteamhouse. Completely free ad-free audio video for both Eyes On and Team House. If you're a $10 member, you get a patch sent from me. It's right here. They're right next to me. I sent out like 30 yesterday. Right there for $10 members. I got to send you a patch, Sean.
Thank you.
Patreon.com/theteamhouse. The High Side Substack. Google it, or the link is in the description. Thanks, guys. This was great.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.